Namaste, everyone, and welcome to Kona session on Hinduphobia in academia and pop culture. My name is Nikunj Trivedi, and I'm the president of Kona, Coalition of Hindus of North America. We are a grassroots advocacy organization that seeks to protect the collective interest of the Hindu community in North America by educating people about Hindu heritage and culture and by working on issues that matter to our community. As we all know, first of all, I want to take a moment and express my condemnation as well as sympathy for the victims of the recent violence in Bangladesh and the blatant Hindu hatred that we see on display. This cannot be ignored by Hindus around the world. And just like all Hindus, we join our Bangladeshi brothers and sisters in expressing shock, anger, and condemnation at the recent events. So with that, I want to also make sure that our fellow Bangladeshi Hindus who are part of our teams within Kona and other Hindu organizations should be assured that they have our support, and we will continue to voice our opinions as well as our anger at the recent events and incidents. So I just wanted to start with that. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Abhijit Iyer Mitra. He joins us from India. And many of you may have been following him on social media. He's done some tremendous work as far as Indian research, defense conversations, as well as research is concerned, along with discussions around Hinduism, sometimes taking some very contrarian views versus other people. So naturally speaking, that does come about as something very, very different. But over the past, I would say, a few months, we started to see something that happened in the United States that had sort of shockwaves around the world. There was a conference that was held on September 11th weekend called Dismantling Hindutva. Kona and many Hindu organizations have done extensive work around it. So we'll talk about some of that. But that spurred a conversation around the broader discussions of Hinduphobia. We have been having these conversations for a while. So we thought that let's bring Abhijit with us here to give his perspective on what he thinks about Hinduphobia in sort of popular culture, academia, etc. So a brief bio about him. Abhijit Iyer Mitra is a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. As a defense economist, he appears regularly in print and on TV, is the author of 2 books, and is doing a PhD at King's College in London. So welcome, Abhijit. Thank you for joining us today.
Good evening, and is it evening out there? Okay, but good evening from here.
It's morning, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No
good morning to all of you, and thanks for having me on, Nikunji. It's important that we look at 2 consistent patterns. It's very important you raised Bangladesh. But there's also, remember, there is targeted killings of Hindus happening in Kashmir at the moment as well.
That is correct.
Both resident Kashmiri Hindus as well as migrant labor who are not taking away jobs from anyone. They're just selling. They're just street vendors out there. Even they are being killed. And both of these are, in a sense, very macabrely fascinating repeat patterns of what happened in 1989 in Kashmir and 1971 in Bangladesh. Because remember, when in Bangladesh, what was then East Pakistan, when the Pakistanis had to sort of wish away their governance failures, the fact that they had failed so miserably to raise up Bangladesh to, East Pakistan to any kind of standard, and were in fact extracting from there, what they would do was they would engage in pogroms against Hindus. Right, that was their classic method of ameliorating the situation in that sense. It's also very important to remember that in 1971, because there's several layers of anti-Hinduism in academia and pop culture. Before the Cold War, that is to say during the colonial period, it mostly used to come from the fact that, oh my God, these native savages haven't really converted. And monotheism is such a great evolution of thought. It is so much more advanced than this shamanistic, half-naked, totemistic, tom-tomming barbarians. That, how is it that we're unable to convince them of our moral and intellectual superiority? Of course, this confuses the fact that if something comes after someone, it's automatically intellectually or morally or in some ways superior. It is not. So, for example, if you look at the medieval period that comes after late antiquity, you can clearly tell that, intellect, everything declined, learning declined, literacy declined, living standards declined massively, etc., etc. So, not the case at all. But this was the belief at that point of time. And in that sense, Islam really appealed to them because binaries are very easy to understand. When you want to simplify something, if you want to write, the idiot's guide to the universe or the idiot's guide to religion, if you make it black and white, it's very easy for people to understand. The absolute good and the absolute bad. It's a very simplistic narrative, but that is effectively what used to happen prior to the Cold War. In the Cold War, what you found was that commentary, so-called academic commentary and academic study, reflected in it was essentially a reflection of politics. And that has a lot to do with the American system, which is a revolving door where all your academic writing isn't really about academia. It's more of a verbal, temporal curriculum vitae that you're essentially doing to appease the powers that be, to take you in as a great intellectual who validates their point of view in that sense. So actual real research is very little. It's more about, giving a veil of pseudo-academic validation to policy. And during the Cold War, that's what used to happen. So you go back and read Henry Kissinger's The White House Years, and it was a two-part book. I forget what the first part was. You will still see, he says, the Hindus are extremely complex and deviant people. The Muslims are straightforward, they don't lie, and they're very direct when he's trying to talk about India, Pakistan. And in a way, that kind of discourse got normalized even into academia at that point of time. Bangladesh was the big split. That is when the Western press, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and all of them, they took a huge gap away from what the narrative was, and they said what America is doing is wrong. You need to stop it. It was one of those rare attacks of moral conscience from a paper whose Jewish owner deliberately ignored the Holocaust of his co-religionists because, he didn't want to upset wasps in the power structure in America at that point of time. And then you come to the post-Cold War, which is probably more important for us today. Yep. Now, during the Cold War, it was really quite fascinating that, and even up to the 90s, you could say, it was kind of fascinating to see that people who grew up communist used to become conservatives once they hit 30. As my grandfather used to say, if you're not a communist under 30, you've got no heart, and if you remain a communist over 30, you've got no brains. I personally felt I was heartless because I remained a communist till I was about 22, 23, fierce communist, by the way. And then I turned conservative by the time I was about 25, 27. So yeah, maybe 30-ish. So I think I'm not that heartless. But anyway, so that used to be the general pattern everywhere, that when you achieve fiscal stability yourself, financial stability, you tend to be much more careful with your money than you tend to be with other people's money, including your own parents' money. So that generally was, a life lesson in taking responsibility for yourself. But what we saw since then is a sort of resurrection of, you can't even call it leftism in a sense. There was this bunch of reprobate degenerates in France around the 60s called the Société Outade at the Sorbonne. And they were essentially child molesters like Derrida and Foucault, who would intellectualize and philosophize their own perversions, which then got exported to America. France is very smart, like every good colonial power. They recognize what's rotten and they popularize it and export it out, but they don't do it themselves.
Okay.
Right.
That's a Western pattern. Sometimes I see that even from the United States, you see that happening.
Absolutely. And, when I lived in the USSR as a kid, the thing used to be, what's America famous for? Female mud wrestling. And so the first time I landed up in America in, 93, 94, I was like, I want to go see female mud wrestling. And I tried everywhere. We did like 14, 15 cities, because, like any Indian, you've got a relation in every goddamn city. And if you go visit and stay with one, they're like, oh, he didn't come to my house, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore, etc., etc. So you have to do all that. So, and everywhere I'd go, I want to say female mud wrestling, and be like, we don't really have that here. That's not really a thing. But when the USSR was breaking up, female mud wrestling for a short while became a thing in the in the erstwhile USSR, because apparently that was an American thing. So anyway, so yes, America does it too. But what you see is this slow sort of institutional capture that happens because of these philosophies. So they create an echo chamber and they do institutional capture. And what is the fundamental basis of this? It's that typical communist concept that you are not responsible for your own actions. Let the state equalize, let it distribute wealth. And so it becomes very necessary that when you've suffered a complete intellectual collapse, that all the bastions of communism have collapsed, you have to dress up the same old sheep in a new, the wolf in a new sheep's hide, in a sense. So before it was a red sheep hide, this time it was a black sheep hide, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, you've always had Indian academics willing to be co-opted into this, because what they do is they essentially create a citation loop. And what a citation loop is, NDTV in India will only get XYZ academic from America, who will then, or ABC academic from India, who will then say NDTV is the only intellectual TV channel, everybody else is sold out media. So NDTV then automatically becomes the only credible citation source, even though it can be completely incredible at times. And these academics will be the only ones that will be celebrated by the media as credible sources. And the New York Times and Washington Post will go in and close that loop. They won't even allow, so for example, I think it was the Washington Post or the New York Times that did an interview on India's COVID situation with the government's chief economic advisor, Sanjeev Sanyal. And they printed a one-line, out of a 1,000-word article, they printed a one-line thing from him, essentially giving the impression that he had validated all their other findings. Unfortunately for him, he had recorded the entire interview and he published it on YouTube, and you saw exactly how leading the questions were and how unwilling the correspondent was to listen to all these things. So remember, this is not something that is disjointed. It is not an organic movement. It is the madness of the crowds with central planning. But where is this central planning coming from? Now, I hate conspiracy theories. So, it's this is some great conspiracy against India. Well, guess what? Sometimes these things happen. It's called zeitgeist. You lay the framework for it and everybody pretty much follows it, because one thing about Western academia is there is these days a great fear of contradiction. The old Hindu tradition of Purva Paksha, which is when you were assured that you knew it, you still were obliged, every single time you were convinced you had achieved the truth, you were obliged to get somebody who would tell you no and have a robust argument against you, to bring you down to earth, to adjust your ego. And so your entire life was a learning process. That doesn't happen in America anymore. You only like to listen to people who validate what you say, not oppose what you say. And if you get opposed, you kind of cancel. That's cancel culture coming in. So what you see is this now blends in with the new kind of sort of ethnocentric, identity-based politics that the Democrats in America are moving towards, which is quite curious, because the left that I grew up in the USSR, we were always taught that identity politics is the absolute worst kind of politics. No true communist will ever play identity politics. You simply should not do it. Because if you're playing identity politics, it means the state has failed and you're going back to these very primitive emotions. And isn't it amazing today that a so-called left-wing movement embraces everything that Karl Marx and co told you exactly not to, and still celebrate it as a celebration of Karl Marx?
Wow, I mean, that's really interesting.
So, it's particularly bizarre. So what you find is today, when you say the American right, it is actually a coalition of the American principled far left and conservatives. There are so many old left-wing people I know who are more willing to accept the conservative right than they are the sort of mainstream accepted uniparty narrative out there. Now, why is this important? Why am I talking about American politics in terms of Hinduphobia? Well, it's because a lot of this politics of ethnicity and things is based on intersectionality.
Correct.
And what is intersectionality based on? You find intersections between your political ideas and communities only if they can bring voting power or financial power to the table. If they can't, their concerns are not valid. They are either labeled class oppressors or caste oppressors or what have you, and you're thrown out of the fold. Now, in this, Hindus can never win. Why? Because Muslims account for a much larger part of the population. They're a much more potent electoral force. They actually come out and organize. And there's a very good reason that they organize, because you look at Hindus both in the UK, Australia, well, all three, UK, Australia, and the US. Hindus tend to be amongst the highest per capita incomes. They have jobs to go to. They have, mouths to feed and things like that. Whereas you look at, say, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and a large percentage of Indian Muslims, they actually slot in almost at the very bottom of every economic index. So there's a significant amount of non-employment out there, which then allows you to have a lot more free time and be a lot more politically engaged. We see these same patterns happening in America, in the UK, and in Australia. So what you have is, for a guy who wants intersectional power in Congress or Senate or the presidency, it's your natural ally. So you will just go ahead with any narrative that comes together, right? Then comes the fact that, with any community, you need to have carrots and sticks. With Hindus, we neither have carrots nor do we have sticks. Mostly we work for other people. The few of us who have startups and things like that, we're not willing to, there's this very assimilationist tendency amongst Hindus. We just blend in. We don't want to make trouble. We don't go out rioting. We don't go around screaming from rooftops. We don't go blaring our loudspeakers and things like that.
Yeah. The so-called model minority.
Very much. And what we do is, historically, we have never been taught substance and salience. So like Samuel Huntington says in his book, Who We Are, what is the identity of what makes a nation? One is substance, what connects us, what connects Nikunj and Abhijit, and salience, what separates Nikunj and Abhijit, say, from Asim Bajwa, the chief of the Pakistani army, right? We don't have salience. We've historically never had salience, and we've historically never had substance either. Let me give you a simple example. In 1094, the Chora emperor, Rajendra Chora, he set off on an expedition to conquer Malaysia and Indonesia, wildly successful. But just 2 years before that, Mahmud of Ghazni had come and destroyed the Shivalinga, the Jyotirlinga, at Somnath. Yeah. Now, what happened at that point of time was that Rajendra Chora was a great devotee of Shiva, but he felt absolutely no pangs at one of your holiest sites being destroyed. He's like, oh, it got destroyed. Okay, yeah, okay, fine, shoot, get lost. Not my concern. On the other hand, about 200 years later, when Hulagu Khan, the grandson or the great-grandson of Genghis Khan, who rules the Ilkhanate, the Persian part of the Mongol Empire, Persia, Iraq, parts of Afghanistan, part of the Mongol Empire, goes and sacks Baghdad and kills the caliph by rolling him into a carpet and trampling him with horses, his cousin, Berke Khan, who rules the Golden Horde, which is basically Central Asia today, Central Asia and Southern Russia today, gets deeply offended. How dare my cousin do this to my caliph? And he actually launches a war. So you look at this difference in mentality. It persists even today, where we can't identify with each other. Even today, amongst Hindus, you'll see these divisions online, where slight theological deviances equals you're not really a Hindu.
Yes. Yes.
And there's some kind of a program to find a common minimum definition of a Hindu, which of course isn't a common minimum definition because nobody agrees on what the definition of a Hindu is. So, and it's always exclusion. It's not about creating allies. It's about creating more enemies. I'm sorry to say this, Nikunj, but, I've seen this a lot in the American Hindu community as well.
Yeah.
I think I've seen more Hindu associations more willing to fight each other than they are to gang up to fight somebody else.
It's very unfortunate. Yes.
It's unfortunate, but it is endemic.
Yeah.
If you've got 11 Hindus in the room, you've got 111 opinions in the room. So unfortunately, that's one of the realities out there. So what you then see is that Hindus, they've never really had state support in any narrative. They've never been incentivized into being unified or having a unified point of view, which also makes it more resilient, but it also makes it unable to stand up to concerted attack when you see concerted attacks happening, which is what we see today. I mean, that global Dismantling Hindutva conference was the tip of the iceberg. Now, some of the speakers said that, there's a difference between Hindutva and Hinduism. And yet about 50% of the other speakers says there's no difference between Hindutva and Hinduism. Why? Because Hindutva is essentially the politicization of the Hindu consciousness. It depends on a consolidation of the Hindu identity, which even today only stands at 38% of the Indian vote, because the remaining 62% don't identify that way. So it's still a work in progress, and obviously they're trying to dismantle that. And how do they do this? They do this in different ways. Classic divide and rule tactics that the British used to use. It's not Hinduism, it's Brahminism. They will never talk about, for example, the fact that the greatest number of attacks on Dalits actually come from Muslims. Why? Because they both occupy the lowest income rungs of Indian society. They usually occupy the same shared spaces. And therefore, given the resource crunch, that is where the most social conflict generates.
Correct.
So, it's all done in a very, very, very deliberate fashion. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, most Indians do not study the humanities. They go in for science, maths, the STEM subjects. Like, with my mom, it was very clear that I'd either be an engineer, or I'd be a doctor, or I'd be a lump of shit. Those were the only options given. Right. And the problem then is, we all go into the sciences, we don't understand the humanities, we don't understand how profound they are. We don't realize that humanities has always ruled STEM. Humanities has always dictated the direction of STEM historically. For science to influence policy has almost been non-existent throughout human history.
Yeah, you call a scientist to get an opinion, not to influence policy.
Exactly. A scientist may be able to control thunder, the waves, lightning, storms, what have you, essentially doing what Indra, Varuna, and Vayu do. But ultimately, it is the Brahmin who tells you, and in that sense, the humanities that tells you what to interpret of it. So that the humanities chap, let's call him the Brahmin for whatever's sake, is the guy who can tell you, look, it's not actually Indra who created that lightning. It was my prayers, my sacrifices into the holy flame, my pouring of the ghee and my intonation of the correct mantra that actually made Indra create that lightning kind of thing, right? That sacerdotal function is what the humanities take over. And that is why sacerdotal functions are so dangerous in society, but they also act as a kind of tempering mechanism on society. And this is what keeps happening. So this has been done several times. You've had the Kashmir genocide completely whitewashed. They will tell you it was not about religion. Gee, really? I mean, it doesn't exactly take much to see that it was about religion, but they'll tell you it wasn't about religion. Then they'll tell you the BJP was complicit, which is actually true. And the problem is most Hindus, because the BJP is the only so-called Hindu party, in an attempt to show that it was a Hindu genocide, will fall into the trap of trying to defend a worthless BJP, which never really cared about Hindus, which you can see even today. The only pro-Hindu thing about the BJP is they don't encourage people to kill you. but they sit pretty quiet, twiddling their thumbs and knitting their sweaters while somebody's out to kill you. So, they create all these traps for us that we walk into without being able to see the picture quite clearly. Finally, I'm sorry, just two more minutes. I'm going to end after that. One of the biggest problems has been that Hindus still don't seem to get the scale and planning and the kind of macro machinations that are worked into this. Why is there an attack on Hindutva? And mind you, the people saying Hindutva is a danger will tell you because it is a Brahminical construct which is attempting to divide people on caste. And yet Hindutva is the only movement that has succeeded in eradicating caste significantly, substantially, consistently over the last 70 to 80 years. You see today India's prime minister, actual prime minister, not a puppet prime minister, is from the OBC caste, one of the disprivileged castes. Right. You look at the president, he's a Dalit. Of course, the president doesn't have any power. That's a different matter. So you have on one hand a movement which is trying to eliminate those divisions. And these people will attack it saying you are the divider for eliminating division. It's literally like the concentration camp guard blaming you for being anti-Semitic by not helping build the narrative of you walking into the gas chamber. Yeah. That's exactly how perverted it is. And the fact that this gets academic validation, and Rutgers put out that absolutely ridiculous statement when Audrey Truscott had engaged in her race baiting and in her religion baiting. And what happens is they stand by and do absolutely nothing when she goes ahead and does this global Hindutva conference. And mind you, the Rutgers students' unions, the Hindu students' unions out there also do nothing. And this is something very uniquely Hindu, what I call the Prithviraj Chauhan complex, that after you defeat Muhammad Ghori the first time, you just sit back, you do nothing, you don't want intel, you don't want to send your spies over to Afghanistan and see what the plans happening out there. You don't want any early warning. You're just sitting there knitting, eating pan, drinking wine, what have you. And then, if he comes, we'll deal with it. You're not dealing with Labradors. You're dealing with Rottweilers. You're not dealing with house cats. You're dealing with Siberian tigers. So, this complacency, and in a sense, I do blame Hinduism for it. This constant belief in the afterlife, it will be better. Somebody else will do it. God will protect us. No, it's not going to happen. Ultimately, we go back to a Prithviraj analogy that if this continues, you're going to be like those 30,000 worshippers inside Somnath's temple who were expecting Somnath to come perform a miracle to save them. And Ghazni came and slaughtered them to the last man, woman, and child.
Yeah, no, and you bring up a good point, and we're going to talk about that because I think you have some very important points. So we'll start from the latest to the going back. So the first one you mentioned was about, how Hindu groups are not doing anything, right? Obviously, there are things that are going on that we cannot share in public, but there are things happening even at Rutgers and beyond. Because what happens is that I think the dismantling global Hindutva, as you said, was a tipping point for many Hindus, especially for me and some of the folks who when we started Kona, we started to see a growth of anti-Hindu sentiment in the North American sphere. And then that, of course, globally as well. So that's one of the reasons why we started what we started, because the piece that is lacking, as you mentioned, is the Kshatriyata, right? We have lost that Kshatriyata, and it's become more, like you said, the afterlife, and most people think, okay, let's just, don't worry about it. These guys are just going to focus on your education, focus on your, go get your degree, get your job. Don't worry about these people. And I think that's the defeatist attitude that we have internalized, right? And for various reasons, historical reasons, because of a lack of, owning our own narrative over the years because of colonization and many things that happened, right? Let's say. The second thing, though, is after the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference, what we have seen is people are actually standing up and they are actually organizing. So we are at this nascent stage, very, very early stage of seeing an ecosystem forming on the Hindu side. And I think that's something that we should be proud of, but we have a long way to go. We can't just, like you said, sit back and eat pan and, go and do this. I think we need to analyze, study. So some of us are focused on that because this just happened right now. That doesn't mean that next year is not going to happen. And it also did not happen in vacuum. As you said, there's an magnificent infrastructure behind. And we're starting to peel the onion, and you'll see more and more of this coming out. For example, you see like universities like University of Pennsylvania who have a hand in this, right? And that came up after some of the discussions that have been going on in public as to who is behind these types of conferences. So University of Pennsylvania's name came out. There are other people who are involved in this. And it took months of planning. You can't have 40 plus university departments just signing up overnight, right? It's happening overnight. So there's a calculated strategy, as you mentioned. Now, on that point, I wanted to just talk about real quick, as Hindu organizations, right? From your perspective, what more can be done? We are starting to organize, right? What more can you think should be done?
I know there's an organization beginning, and in that sense, we've got to thank Dismantling Global Hindutva. It's such a mouthful, isn't it? It's so tough to pronounce. DGH, yeah. Just like their addled brains, it's like a full mouth addle, whatever. But the first thing we need is academic rigor when we accuse somebody of Hinduphobia. So first, we need a definition of Hinduphobia. We need clear markers and criteria of Hinduphobia. And next, we need to have a Hinduphobia meter, which is made public every year, where universities and university professors are rated on the level of threat that Hindu parents feel from them. And it is made public name and shame.
Wonderful.
Right. Yeah. Because when you have a clear set barometer, it then becomes much easier to hold people up. Indians have never been great at archiving. I would say 99% of Hindu knowledge has been lost simply because we never believed in archiving anything.
Yeah.
And archiving is not just writing it down. It's also creating redundancy in retrieval and contextual retrieval, that when somebody is searching for this, it is the ease of finding things and being able to retrieve it.
Yes.
So, we need that. We need more Indians going into the humanities, more Indians understanding humanities. It doesn't even have to be a formal humanities, but, a consistent summer camps for, not for kids, but for grown adults or adolescent folks to understand what these methodologies are, to understand how the system works, how to make your point, how not to fall into rhetorical traps. These are all very, very important things, because creating institutional things that last beyond our lifetimes and not being attached to it as my child. Yes. I created this, it is my child, therefore I will prioritize over that. You can't have that. So that is something that the institutions we build around the organization, that's what's important. And the permanence of those institutions, the political clout of those institutions. So all of this becomes an issue. I think the fight back isn't going to start from India, because India, being a third world country, has extremely low human development. It has an extremely crude, unsophisticated understanding of things. It is mostly illiterate about politics abroad. It is equally illiterate about humanities in India, because let's face it, even the best humanities institutions in India are complete rubbish, very primitive, very skewed. It has to start from the NRIs. And I think in that, we really need to start looking at the French example and understanding how ruthless, uncompromising secularism will always favor the most law-abiding, peaceful community.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point you bring up, because from an organization perspective, I think the NRI Hindus, or people who are not living in India but in other countries, especially like you said, the US, UK, Australia, etc., can create that movement, and that's what we are trying to do now. I've been involved in Hindu activism since I was young, in through the Hindu Students Council and stuff like that, and I continue to be. But one of the sources of inspiration that I've seen is the thinkers who challenge the status quo. Right? Sometimes, people like yourselves, or for example, Rajiv Malhotra ji and others, say uncomfortable things, right? But it's a dose of reality that is needed for our community, because we are so complacent in the status quo. And I've challenged the Hindu community many times and said, okay, look at all of you sitting on the stage 10, 20, 30 years down the line, who is going to be taking over? The houses that you have made, the organizations that you have made, who's going to do this, right? Where does that infrastructure then lead to? And I can tell you, working with a lot of students, they could care less about any of these things, and they could care less of taking over. Forget about taking over, getting involved in these organizations. So we have a huge sort of like this gap where the older generation, and they have done some good work. There's no doubt about that. I'm not gonna, obviously they've done work. They have worked really hard. People of my parents' age, my grandparents who age and stuff like that, who have worked hard, but that the advocacy, the political influence is only been the selfie style, right? It's like there was a politician who basically said that, what do Hindus really want? I never hear from them what Hindus really want. Yeah. They come and give me a nice fat $10,000 check, and I say, okay, what is it that I would like? And then they turn around and says, I'd like a nice selfie with you.
Selfie.
Right? So the selfie culture has to go away. Otherwise, what happens is we are going to be, if you look at other communities, much respect to them. They'll sit there, before they hand over the check, they'll say, here are the demands that we have. And this is where you would like congressman, congresswoman, or assemblyman, whoever you want to call it, we would like your support and your tweet on this or that. And you see that happening, right? So we need to really take that on. So, but now let's come back to, you talked about this idea of citation loop, okay, earlier. And I think that's a really important piece that a lot of people don't understand, that we need to build similar type of citation loops for us. That only goes, people, if we were right, if we were only talking about truth and justice and really philosophy, Hindus would win, but without a doubt, because we have very strong philosophical minds. However, it's not always about
Nikunj,
that.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your story, if you I think I deleted that tweet since my jail stint, but when I was in Sicily, in Syracuse, I went to the house of Archimedes, and there's a stone, it looks like a stone bath there. So I sat in it and I ran out of it. I took off all my clothes and ran naked around saying, Eureka, Eureka. But you know how Archimedes died?
No.
He thought like a Hindu, that you can reason your way out of things. So when the tyrant of Syracuse, they weren't actually tyrannical, they were just called the tyrants. When the tyrant of Syracuse said, the Roman fleet is approaching, what can I do? What Archimedes first did was, there was a rock. He put a stick there and he just did this. And he said, look, I've moved the earth, so the Roman fleet is going to take longer to come. Now, theoretically, it could have been true, but practically, it really wasn't. The Roman fleet came and they sacked Syracuse. And when they were sacking Syracuse, these bunch of Roman soldiers barged into Archimedes' house, and he was working on some elaborate theory of pi and circles and things like that. And he told the Roman soldiers, you fools, don't step on my circles. I'm working out their diameter or their circumference or whatever. And the Roman soldiers said, okay, I won't step on your circles. And he just bent over and pushed his sword into Archimedes' stomach.
Yeah.
We're like that. This philosophizing, philosophy doesn't win wars. There's a reason that the barbarians burnt Rome. There's a reason that Turks and Mongols conquered far, far more superior civilizations like Byzantium and Persia and Egypt. Barbarians always win. Okay, philosophy is wonderful at times of peace. It isn't going to get you squat in times of war.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's an important part that we need to develop, that it's not that we're going to go and pick up swords and things like that, but what's important is we need to strengthen ourselves from a narrative perspective. And that citation loop that you mentioned, I'll give you a great example. You talked about Sanjeev Sanyal. A similar thing happened to us, where we actually were having and I'm not going to discuss the details, but we were having a couple of interviews with some of these media houses. So what you realize is that the reporter continued to press me and and ask me questions that would basically put me in a trap, and to get their viewpoints. And I continue to avoid. One rule that I've learned is you don't have to answer the question that is given to you, that is asked of you.
Correct.
So, yeah. They kept asking me this question about Hindutva, because they were trying to get to a point. So I completely avoided it. And what they ended up doing is they ended up not using me as a citation in their citation loop. Instead, they took a tweet of Kona that was done a while ago to completely out of context to add to their narrative.
Yeah.
And second one was a guy from New York that actually interviewed us. And he went ahead and published a very scathing article based on twisted things that he had taken. This is the type of citation loop that we need to create. And I think, coming back to your point about Hinduphobia, I also want to share with you that there was a conference earlier here in the United States where scholars of the Hindu community came together, and it's called Understanding Hinduphobia. So they came up with a very nice definition of Hinduphobia that we have formally endorsed, and we're going to be using and trying to popularize, because that definition we need to coalesce around and popularize it, so that now we have a framework, and then we report on it, which is what we're starting to do, and create academic opportunities and conferences and scholarship around this topic. So I'm really happy that you brought up that solution, because that's exactly kind of where we are starting to migrate towards. And you'll see this happening over the next several months. The Understanding Hinduphobia 2022 is going to be happening at some point, potentially in a university setting, hopefully physically, but let's see, at least virtually it will happen. So now let's come back to this idea of exporting ideas. Okay, we talked about the French, we talked about the Americans, different people from the Western world exporting ideas that are sort of like not good here and goes outside. What about the opposite? Can we, you mentioned, for example, NRIs, right? How can we, as sort of American Hindus or kind of Canadian Hindus or British Hindus, export good ideas into India? Because ultimately, let's be honest, right? 95% of Hindus live in India. There are issues going on, but I think positive ideas can be infectious, and they can go back. So what are your thoughts on that?
See, it's not how good the idea is, it's how strong an ecosystem that supports the idea that matters. So that's extremely important in getting ideas across. We need to start reaching out and getting news outlets that that would be indifferent or disinterested into issues. So, why do we constantly keep seeking validation from New York Times and New York and Washington Post and things like, and Wall Street Journal? Go to Fox News. Go to Fox News. The issue is they're too America-centric. They don't care about Hindus in India and things like that. Start building those bridges. Go to New York Post. Go to all these things and do that. We can't fall for this Groucho Marx adage, I don't want to be a member of a club that will have me as its member. And so you always want to enter the club that will not have you as its member. So these are two very, very important things. The coercive elements have to be developed. The sticks have to be developed. And the engagement, the broad level engagement needs to be developed.
As a community, we have enough sort of like information available to win what we need to do from a very, we just haven't done it, right? The problem is that we haven't done it. We have not taken up that aggressive sort of like attitude that, if you're going to be against our community, you're not going to get our support. You could be.
And the most important thing, Nikunj, that you need to do is come out with a report card of Indian bureaucrats serving in America, because they tend to go from either incompetent to indifferent. There needs to be a public report card on their community engagement. Name every single bureaucrat and give them name and shame. Name and shame is the game.
Now, we talked about Indian Hindus a lot. Let's talk about non-Indian Hindus. In the United States, but also outside, there's a very good non-Hindu community, a non-Indian community rather. Whether you talk about the Caribbean Hindus, who of course are connected to from Indian origin perspective, but then you have the white Hindus, even the black Hindus, right? And many of them are more bhakti oriented, no doubt about it. But there's a very interesting group of those types of people who are very strongly who are very vocal about Hindu issues. So you can see some of the names that are out there, like Dr. David Frawley, for example, right, who has been very vocal about Hindu issues. Many others are out there. How do we, as Indian Hindus, right, many of us coming of Indian origin or born and raised here, it doesn't matter, how can we ally or get them closer to us and they can be our spokesperson or people, because they are part of our community, not just Indian, but the Hindu community?
So, I've been listening to a lot of them on Clubhouse, and I'm just astounded at how well they understand Hinduism. They've taught me things that taught me to look at things in a way that I never thought I could. We have to have community engagement. We need to have systemic. The name of the game is institutions. You need to have institutions where we ensure revenue streams for these people, selective hiring for these people, ensuring that, they get platformed, ensuring that they have revenue streams, ensuring they have outlets for their expression, and incentivizing them to go about and engaging with their own ethnic communities.
Great point. Exactly. Now, another question I'm going to ask you, what about non-Hindu allies? Because as you had mentioned earlier, some of the other communities are very good at building allyship. And when you look at some of the things that are going on in the United States, particularly, you're familiar with the whole idea of ethnic studies and sort of this social justice movement happening. And there are certain communities. So in the case of California, I'll give you an example. They passed the ethnic studies curriculum. Okay, you have Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Armenians, many different groups included in there. Hindus are missing.
Yeah.
Okay. And I blame our community, because the reason I blame that is because we never even tried to have a seat at the table. Forget about arguing and forcefully asking for it. We are a micro minority, right? Just like every group that I mentioned earlier, we are a micro minority in the United States. We should have a seat at that table. Well, we never asked for one. So how do we ally with groups that not Hindus, but they understand our concerns? They can understand why Hindus need to be given a seat at the table. And this don't have to be other minorities. It could also be the majority. It doesn't matter. You could have blacks, you could have whites, different types of people. What are your thoughts? How can we do that?
Look, the first thing is to identify what our points of conflict are and what our bridges are. You have evangelical Christians who do feel alienated, but who are a powerful force. And the only issue there with India is the fact that there is an anti-conversion, an ethos against conversion. Now, this is something that has to be negotiated. Now, personally, I've never been against conversion because I believe it's a marketplace of ideas. If you believe that something is good for you, or somebody is able to offer you incentives, which, it's wonderful saying Krishna, Krishna, Krishna all day, but if your kid has chemotherapy to do and saying Krishna, Krishna ain't paying your bills, and if saying Jesus, Jesus does pay your bills, please say Jesus, Jesus. Right? So there are these compromises that have to be made. Ultimately, this is a cost-benefit analysis that the community has to undertake. It is contextual. It is based on finances, a lot of it. It's based on shared values, shared interests, or if you can agree not to talk about certain things.
Yeah, so you agree to disagree on those things, and then you kind of find common ground, you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So for example, as an organization, we would be vehemently against conversion, right? No matter what it is. Now, we can, of course, discuss solutions and all that stuff. But the point is, as an organization, we would be against that, or any of those types of things, right?
You agree to mutual mutually agreed abstract condemnations.
Correct. Exactly.
Right. So when something happens in India, you will accept in discussion with evangelicals, you will accept a sort of resolution coming out.
Yeah.
Similarly, if something happens out here in terms of an anti-conversion campaign, which I know something that Kona needs to condemn, you first go consult with them and create a consensus document that condemns them, which we're all fine with. I recognize you have a public need to do this. There is this is the difference between posturing and positioning. The problem with the Hindu mind is that for a religion that is all about the shades of gray, we've become so black and white, we don't understand the difference between posturing and positioning.
Yes, exactly. And so some of those are public and some of those are private conversations, no doubt about it. So that's a good point. Now, even within the Jewish community, we have seen the binaries, right? We have obviously allies who have been working very closely with us. For example, there was this whole issue with the swastika campaign that happened in the state of New York and then in New Jersey. So there were Jewish groups who allied with us. There are other places where we have been allies. And then, of course, there are disagreements. So we kind of agree to disagree on certain things. One place that I think we are missing, which as a community we need to do more, is the Black community. Because we share a lot
of Hispanics.
And Hispanics. Yeah, so Blacks and Hispanics, I think we share a lot of commonalities, a lot of struggles that we have seen, whether it's racism, Hinduphobia, they see something like that. But also just the ancestry, right?
Yeah.
We are a colonized people. As when you look at Hispanics, if you look at Blacks, etc., even Native Americans, we are all a colonized community that has not realized that we have been colonized for years, and we have not owned up to it, right? So there is a common allyship that needs to be built. So I think that's another place. What are your thoughts?
Look, and this is where you deploy the Guyanese Indian community or the Fijian Indian community in outreach with the Blacks, saying you were slaves, we were indentured labor, we've been through the same things. With the Native American community, you say, you worship many gods, we worship many gods. This is why they treat us like shit. So we now desperately need to start building these alliances. And this is where the diversity of Hindus in America comes into play. And, this is where it does not need to be associated with the BJP, because if the BJP doesn't protect Hindus, and if the Indian embassy doesn't protect Hindus, we need to be ready to flush them down the toilet.
Yes. No, of course, look, I look at it this way. For me, as obviously as a person, but also as an organization, we are nonpartisan, and we have Hindu interest in mind first and foremost. We don't care about political parties. We know whether it's a political party on the left or the right or the center. It's more about where Hindu interests lie, right?
Yeah.
And even parties in India, right? Today there's BJP. Tomorrow there could be another party. Tomorrow could be another prime minister. So putting your chips in one person and saying, hey, let's support this person or that person, that's not the interest of the Hindus collectively. We
Absolutely.
need to figure out different strategy.
The Anti-Defamation League is a fantastic model to follow.
Yes.
You don't have to win a case. You just need to force them to deploy so many financial resources that it becomes unsustainable.
Yeah, that is true. And I think the Hindu community has the capability of doing that today, because we have the financial
But they don't
resources.
have the unity of doing that. There's not a single Californian American that I've interacted with, not one. I literally mean this, not one, that has anything good to say about another Californian Indian. Literally. When you bring up their names, hey, do you know this guy, they'll suddenly fall very silent. Abhijit, I just want to warn you, bastard, maha bastard, super bastard. Don't talk to these three people.
Yeah, and that's you make that point about California, but I can tell you across the board we have that issue, because the moment, like you said, there are 10 Hindus in the room, there'll be 110 opinions, and the challenge we face is everybody wants to be a leader, nobody wants to be a follower, right?
Exactly.
In the same room, you'll find, because I think that you cannot look at people's age, you cannot look at people's face, you cannot look at people's gender. Look at their experience and expertise.
Exactly.
And then say, is this person the right person to lead this area or that area? and then divide and conquer, because we create resources, we duplicate, because everybody wants to be a leader, everybody wants to be in the limelight, but nobody realizes how much darn experience have you had battling these people. Have you been the general who's sitting in the chair and just chatting away, or the general who has fought the battle?
And this is why you need to have a graded promotion system.
Yeah.
Have multiple avenues to leadership, but you need to have done spade work. You can't, okay, fine. Spade work doesn't just have to be, distributing posters and getting Hindus out to vote.
No, yeah.
It can also be writing papers and op-eds and things like that. It can be raising funds. It can be whatever. But there has to be, just because you're somebody very rich who has a lot of money doesn't buy you a seat at the table.
Yeah, exactly. And the person who has the money, I would say, give it to the people who can create that influence for you, right? And that's what a lot of communities do.
And therein lies the that is the Hindu tragedy for the last 1,000 years. No Hindu will ever do that, right?
Well, hopefully we
invented the fundraiser. The American fundraiser was invented by Hindus sometime around 700-800 AD, where money is what talks. The more money you have, the greater influence you have. You buy a generalship, you buy a governorship, you buy an emperorship or a kingship and things like that.
Yeah.
But I would say first develop disruptive capabilities. It may not succeed, but it doesn't matter. The BJP took how many years to come to power? 50, 60 years? This can't be achieved in 2 years. You will fail again, and then you will fail again, and then you will fail again, and then you will succeed.
Yeah.
So it has to be a long-term program.
It does. You're right. Awesome. Well, we're at the hour. I really want to thank you for, for all the wonderful insights that you have. A lot of discussions, points that we as Hindus certainly in North America, but globally should be considering. Naturally, sometimes we, as Hindus, like you said, we don't always agree on points, but that's okay. As long as we can agree to disagree and then ally on the points that we can agree on and for the benefit of the Hindu community in general. I think that's what we need to really focus on, because no two Hindus will ever agree on anything in life. So that's just, right. But that's the diversity of our culture, right? That's the beauty and diversity of our culture. And that's what keeps us alive, because if we all had one organized religion, one organized book, we would have been out for a long time ago. But now I think we need to coalesce around common threats and common challenges, come up with a good framework, definitions of Hinduphobia, scholarship, ecosystem, etc., and have folks like yourselves who can every so often provide that scholarship and then that kind of expertise on key ideas and topics. Because I think folks like yourselves and others that we have either on the platform today or we want to have in the platform in the future can provide that insight, because you have a different perspective, and having that different perspective is enriching for the overall community. Because if we're all we need to get out of that echo chamber and see what's really out there. And I really want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to do a lot more things with you as we go forward.
Always a pleasure, Nikunj. Great talking to you, and here's best of luck to going forward to you and Kona.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you, Nikunj. Namaste. Thank you.